What's up, guys? Jeff with Shock Surplus here with Steve and his Ranger. Today we're going to be throwing on Bilstein 5100s and SPC upper control arms. We're going to be setting the 5100s at the 2.5 inch setting. Currently, Steve has the SVC coil spring spacers on the truck, and right now he does have a little bit of a positive camber going on, and the SPC arms should be able to correct that. Steve, you want to? What are you expecting from what we're going to do today?
Hopefully a better ride quality, and hopefully we correct that angle so I get less tire wear. Right now it's starting to wear the tires on the outside, and that's not good.
You got the factory strut with the SVC spring spacer out of the truck, and I have them laid out right here. This is a factory strut with a strut spacer on the top. This is the factory strut with the SVC spring spacer, and the Bilstein 5100s. The 5100s are set at the number 5 setting for 2.5 inches of lift. So one thing we're going to do is take some measurements. Fully extended, the Bilstein 5100s from the top mount to the bottom of the bar pin. You're looking at about 20.5 inches. On the factory length strut, we're looking at about 20.125 of an inch. And on the factory strut with the strut spacer, fully extended, you're looking at 21.125 of an inch. So this factory strut with the strut spacer is going to be a full inch longer than the factory strut without a spacer. So what does that mean? Your axle is going to drop out a little bit further, but fully compressed, the strut spacer is going to be longer, fully compressed, than the factory spacer without, or the factory strut without the spacer. And on the Bilstein 5100s, it's going to have a little bit more travel because you're using the full length of the strut to accommodate the lift. So if you look at the SVC off-road spring spacer and the Bilstein 5100s, you can see the way they achieve the lift is very similar. If you look at the lower mount on the factory strut, the spring goes all the way down about here. On the factory strut with the SVC spring spacer, the spacer moves that lower mount a little bit higher to about here. So it moves it about an inch higher. And then on the Bilstein 5100s, very similarly to the SVC spring spacer lift, it just moves the lower spring mount up higher. We should be getting more lift out of the Bilstein 5100s because the lower spring is actually a little bit higher than the SVC spring spacer setup. We're going to go ahead and take the springs off, and we're going to put them in the truck individually and cycle the suspension to show you the actual travel numbers, how much droop you gain with the 5100s versus the factory struts, and how much bump travel you lose with the strut spacer and the lifted struts. All right, we got the new SPC upper control arms here and the old Ford stamped steel arms here. Just weight alone, you could feel this thing is going to be a lot more durable, a lot sturdier. And looking at the ball joints, much bigger ball joint on the SPC versus this Ford upper control arm. One of the key things on the SPCs, and what makes them really nice, is you could adjust your camber by sliding this plate in and out, and your caster, you could adjust the caster by rotating. This ball joint is indexed up at the top, and you could adjust your camber by rotating where this location of the ball joint is. And with the larger ball joint, it also comes down a little bit further. So when you have your lifted truck, more travel in your suspension, this bigger ball joint, this lower ball joint is going to allow for more articulation and more range of motion. You can see here, this is ball joint maxed out. The Ford Max is out to right here. You could see that pretty easily. There's a little bit more more angle on that SBC arm. So we're gonna get these installed now. What we're gonna do on the SBC ball joint is we're gonna leave this at a +1 caster setting. So that's gonna give you 1 more degree of caster than the factory arms. And then we're also gonna leave this top nut loose, just so that we could adjust for camber later on when we get everything installed. We have the factory strut, factory mounts, no strut spacers or anything on here right now. We took the spring off because we're gonna put it in to the truck and we're gonna cycle the suspension. What that's gonna do is we're gonna be able to take measurements of the travel, fully drooped out, fully compressed, without having the spring get in the way of us being able to do so. We're gonna do that for this one, just the factory length with no strut spacer. We're gonna do the same for the factory strut with the strut spacer, and then we're gonna do the same thing for the Bilstein 5100s. So we have the factory strut in place. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and take a measurement of it fully drooped out. We're gonna go from the ground to the center of the axle nut, and we're sitting at 18 and actually we're sitting at right about 19 inches fully drooped out. So we're just gonna go write that down. And we're gonna take this jack that's right about full bump. And from the ground to the center of the axle, looking at right at 25¼ inches. Now that we have that measured out, this is factory travel numbers. How it comes out of the factory. We're gonna go ahead and pull this out and install the factory FX4 struts with the strut spacer, and we're gonna go ahead and get those measurements. Now we have the factory strut with the strut spacer in the truck. This is a 1-inch spacer. It's supposed to provide 2.5 inches of lift. So we're gonna go ahead and make the same measurements from the ground to the center of the axle at about 17 1/8. Which is almost 2 full inches lower in droop height than without the spacer. So 24. At full bump, we are at 24 and 3/4 of an inch. with the strut spacer and the factory strut, we have the suspension fully bumped out and from the center of the axle to the ground, measuring at 24 3/4 inches. One thing I want to note when we drop down the axle with this strut at full droop, one important thing to look at is this the CV axle angle. If you were to compare this CV axle angle to the previous strut, OEM strut, you'll see that this is a lot steeper. And what happens is at full droop, this CV angle is so steep, it'll cause some CV binding issues because the angles aren't the angles of the CV axle aren't where it was really designed to be working at. And what happens with that is it leads to premature CV wear. Now, strut spacers, are they all bad? Depends on what you're using the truck for. If you're just going to be daily driving the truck, not going to be going off road, not going to be flexing out the suspension all the time, you know, you get by just fine. But if you're going to be out, you're going to be off road, hitting the trails, this is going to cause some premature wear, and it's just not going to ride right. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and take this off, and we're going to take some measurements on the Bilstein 5100 struts, and see what those measurements look like, and see if we gain or lose any travel with the Bilstein 5100s. All right, we got the Bilstein 5100, and at full droop, we are looking at 17 7/8. And at full compression, we are looking at 25 1/2 inches. So comparing the numbers, with the factory struts, we're at 19 inches of droop, 25 5/8. We'll just call it 25 1/2 inches when it was from the ground to the center of the axle at full bump. And with this 1-inch spacer, the 1-inch thick spacer for the 2 1/2 inches of lift, we were at 17 1/8 from full droop from the axle to the ground, and at full bump it was 24 3/4 of an inch. And with the 5100s at full droop, 17 inches from the ground to the center of the axle, it was 17 7/8 of an inch. And at full compression, it was at 25 1/2. So what does that mean? Looking at the droop travel numbers, or the droop measurements, the 5100s were still about, all right, so what do all these numbers mean? Well, let's break it down. The Bilstein 5100s from the ground to the axle, fully drooped out, was 17 7/8 of an inch. And the factory strut with the spacer was 17 1/8 of an inch. And the factory struts with no spacer drooped out at 19 inches. So the Bilstein 5100s have about 1 1/8 more droop than the factory struts, and 3/4 of an inch less droop than the factory struts with a spacer. But at full droop, you can see CV axles don't look so steep. So that's just the right amount of droop, in my opinion, because your CV axles are are still at a good angle at full droop. Not going to have any binding issues, and still droop out a little bit more than the factory struts. At full compression, Bilstein 5100s bumped out at 25.5 inches. The factory struts with the spacer bumped out at 24.75 of an inch, and the factory struts bumped out at 25.5. We'll just call it 25.5 inches. So when you compare the full bump measurements between the factory struts and the Bilstein 5100s, they bumped out at the same measurement, but you have more travel with the 5100s. To figure out your actual travel numbers, you would take your full droop or your full bump measurement, subtract the full droop measurement, that gives you your full total travel numbers. So what does all that mean? With the proper lift strut, you could have so what does all that mean? Well, with a proper lift strut, you could have your 2.5 inches of lift and still have the right amount of travel.
It's all or nothing.
Day 2, Steve had the chance to drive the Ranger from the office back home and back to the office again this morning. So what are your first thoughts on it?
First thoughts are, honestly, improvement over the ride. I feel a lot smoother in all those big potholes in LA. Also, seems like the compression is a little bit from that when compressing that factory spring down. Kind of feel those little jitteries still. That doesn't really change right that. Just a nature of the beast, if you will, right that. So, but I also tow with it. I also drive it off road, commute in it. So it's kind of a jack of all trades, Home Depot trips, you know. So I think this is actually the right setup for what it is right now. So.
Yeah, the digressive valving in the 5100s is going to be perfect for that. Mm-hmm. We also did the SPC arms, upper control arms. So Steve does still need to get in alignment. And he's going to get that done in a few days. Mm-hmm. So next week we're going to be going to King of the Hammers. Steve's towing his camp trailer, and we'll get you some towing feedback on the setup as well. Yeah. If you guys have questions, comments, you guys not sure what to get for your own truck, hit us up, leave a comment, give us a call, and we'll be more than happy to answer those for you.